All right, what's up? Welcome everybody. Glad to be back on the throne, the purple scissor-up throne, Syzygy throne, my purple scissor-up Syzygy throne. Shout out to Chalk.com, show sponsor. Be sure and head over to Chalk.com. Use the promo code J40 to get 40% off, JAY40, or J44Life to get more of a discount for subscriptions to the best in supplementation online. The supplements are legit. The supplements work, especially things like the Tonkatali. We also have another blessed sponsor, and that is Lore Coffee. And I want to give a shout out to Lore Coffee because they had a funny little thing going where Lore Coffee sent me a joke. Y'all familiar with jokes? A little bit of ha-ha, a little bit of shizits and giggles. This is Lore Coffee's Libertarian Blend. And guess what's in here? Guess what's in here? Skittles. Just a little bit of a joke from Lore Coffee. Don't worry, they're not going to send you a bag of Skittles unless you're a e-celebrity diva like myself. What they do send, however, is the recent Death to the World blend, which they have. And this beast thing here, I thought this was aptly titled. This is the All Night Vigil blend. So this is to keep you up. This thing is a beast right here. This is, I mean, it's about like a skull. It's like the size of a skull, basically. So go head on over to Lore Coffee. The link is in the show description. You support a excellent, solid Orthodox company, Lore Coffee. The link is in the show description. And I thought I should also not hold off on promos until the end. I got this bad habit of where my mind is usually thinking of one thing and I forget to talk about the sponsors until the end, and that's not the wisest thing to do. I did bite the crap out of my tongue. And so if I have a gay lisp, it is because I've chosen to have the lisp. The lisp has nothing to do with the biting of my tongue. So certain words such as theology or fragilistic expialiosis will all come with a prepackaged internal fake and gray lisp for your listening pleasure. I know many men, many women find lists to be audibly pleasurable. It is a form of ASMR, as they call it. Anyway, I may be continually sucking in air because it seems to feel good when the air hits the exposed bloody meat of my tongue. And I have to say that I know that Lore Coffee is legit because, I mean, I took a sip of that stuff with a hacked up tongue, and I mean, it was like the caffeine was directly going into my bloodstream. So check out Lore Coffee. Thank you. And by the way, they sent a whole bunch of blends. I can't even keep up with. They sent the Bridge, milk chocolate blueberry pecan, which is a mix of various blends. So shout out to them for that. Housekeeping. A little bit of housekeeping. As you may know or may not know, probably the biggest debate of the year was just had. And it was myself, Sam Shamoon, and we faced off against, originally, Daniel Hakikachu, bless you, and Jake. Jake doesn't know about the Trinity. That Jake. Jake had a suspicious internet problem right before the debate, and so we had to they found a backup. It was Ijaz. Ijaz is not somebody that we typically interact with, but so it was what it was. Turned out basically a 3-hour demolition. Now, because of the structure of the debate, 5 and 4 minute responses, there wasn't a lot of time to explicate all of the complex doctrines that the Muslims always bring up. Explain Trinity, 1, 1, 1 equal 1. Explain Christology, how God one and God man and God, not all one. How can it be? And then, of course, Ijaz farting. That was classic as well for 20,000, 30,000 people live. Anyway, long story short, go read the comments. They're amusing. Here's the debate on YouTube. It's had over 500,000 here. And the comments are 95 to 98% Islam. It was devastated here. Muslims lost this debate. Even other Muslims like Dr. Khalil, who debated Jake, have stated that the Muslims were completely demolished. Now, over on this website, Grumble, we've had 180,000 views on it. And on Twitter, it's had, that's my copy of it. The original upload is approaching 1 million. So let's see. Here it is. The original is 860,000 views right here. So far the largest viewership is Twitter. The comments are quite amusing. I highly recommend reading them. Islam. The worst thing that could happen to Islam is the internet. Islam will die through the internet. That has 7,000 likes. Without lies, Islam dies. There's probably 1,000 people that commented that. And I think the biggest gaffe in the entire debate that was really making everyone kind of laugh was the mistake when they wanted so vehemently to prove that the Bible in so many places predicts Islam and Muhammad, and then they turned around and said, well, the Bible's also full of errors. Oh, okay, so the Bible only works when it backs up whatever arbitrary thing you want to prove. And that's what I said at the very beginning, that the Muslims would have a complete, total double standard in their argumentation. And everybody, I think, saw that. And I mean, the comments are just like, I mean, we're at like 30,000 comments, 29,600. And you're very hard pressed to find any Muslims that thought that the Muslims actually did good. Anyway, so thank you guys for that. All the support everybody gave over there. Thank you guys for watching and spreading it. I think it will go down as, you know, one of like the top, at least the top debates of this year. I mean, we're already at around 2 million views collected across the various platforms, which is great. And, oh, you guys didn't even see any of that. My bad. Yeah, it's right here. So 180,000 on Grumble. 500,000 here, and then on X, as I said, we're at like where's it at? See, I mean, like random comments, random clips, you know, are like 50, 100,000 here and there. So a lot of eyes on that debate. Keep me in your prayers. We know what happens if Muslims get mad. They don't seem to rationally handle things very well. Anyway, where's the... And then, of course, you may be aware I had Sam afterwards on with Lord Voldemort. And you can go watch that video on my Twitter if you haven't seen it. Where's the original damn debate? I just had it. Anyway, you can go watch it. It has 860,000 on Twitter. So the biggest viewership was Twitter. Now, Eric Ibarra put out a tweet shifting to the Catholic stuff, saying that no one will debate him and he can't find anybody to debate. I said I would debate him. Ubi offered to debate him. And Eric, of course, ignored them. And went on to say, no one will debate me. And so this is just such a bizarre form of victory. No one will debate me. I'll ignore the main two guys in the Orthodox world who always want to debate me. I at least did kind of force my way into a debate with Eric years ago in 2018, which he still whines and cries about. still whining and crying about internet cartoon strips that made fun of him that his children saw. Oh, well, welcome to the internet, Eric Ibarra. Internet cartoon strips. They're called memes. And you'll notice here, Ubi says, if you were looking for an orthodox to debate, you could have messaged me. I've offered you dozens of opportunities to debate. Eric never takes him up on it. I have an open debate challenge. You can contact me and hash out the details. And of course, Eric ignores it. And he ignored mine. And so I just went on to jokes. And that got me blocked. Not that I care. I literally don't care if Eric Ibarra blocks me. I think Eric Ibarra is the biggest vajayjay on the internet. Imagine 6-7 years later still whining about people making jokes about you 6-7 years ago. And so I said, Eric, let's debate whether it's 400 or 500 here. What do you think about it? How about we debate that? Is that more in your wheelhouse? Candy Ibarra. Because you can notice from this picture here from the side, I mean, this is like, I went to the danger zone. Danger zone. Now, I mean, these people are such gigantic vajayjays that any type of joke, they have a meltdown. And so people say, well, why are you being mean? You're just giving him... He's been crying and whining for 6 years about a joke 6 years ago. He'll never stop crying and whining. So there's no point in even worrying about it. And by the way, I said, hey, Eric, let's debate Vatican I, pre-Vatican II theology versus post-Vatican II theology. Ignored. I said, hey, Eric, let's debate whether or not the best explanation for the papacy in the 20th century is the infallible charism of Peter, so-called, or geopolitical subversion. Let's debate that. Silence. Ignore. And he saw the comments because he said, in reference to Jay, people were bringing me up, it can't happen on this platform, meaning Matt Fradd. So in other words, he can only allow on the person that Matt Fradd supposedly allows on. And of course, Jay Dyer will never go on my channel. Because if you impersonate somebody or if you make a joke, these people are so thin-skinned and so vajayjay that they can't handle the slightest criticism. And this is really I think all of this just demonstrates the weakness of their position. And again, I know I'm always talking up Tim Gordon, but when I first met Tim, we started out talking smack. Tim Gordon and I were talking smack back and forth. He's sending me fart memes. We had a bit of, a normal dude smack talking interaction. And afterwards, we got to be cool. And this is a kind of a thing that dudes do naturally to kind of shit test other dudes. It's just normal. And because you want to see, is this guy able to handle a little bit of give and take? Is he a man, or is he controlled by his emotions and extremely sensitive and freaks out at the first type of criticism or pushback? And, it actually worked out for the good. I've hung out with Tim in person. He had a beer. I don't drink. I could say shared beers, except I don't drink beer. He had beers. I had kombucha. So I played it like the hippie man drinking kombucha, and Tim had actual beers. Also, Tim is actually a tall basketball playing sort of buff dude. So we were hanging out at Elliot Hulse's house. Elliot Hulse, who's also a really nice dude, gave us a fattest dinner his wife cooked. We ate with his family, had a great time. They're all really great dudes on a personal level. We disagree theologically, but get along very well in person. Not so with these other clown troop figures like Ibarra or Carbohydrate Lofton. They're extremely sensitive and effeminate and resort to really disingenuous feminine tactics. And when we get into tonight's topic, we're going to get into some of those tactics. Not so much feminine tactics, but although that actually does play into an element of this. And that is Grape of the mind. And I'm saying that, as you can imagine, because we are over here on YouTube, and so we're going to keep it friendly here, by Joost Merloo. This is a famous book, somewhat well known in the field of psychological warfare, brainwashing, totalitarianism. I don't agree with everything in this book. It's written from the perspective of someone who was a pro-ally World War II era person. It's written in 1950, I think, and but there are a lot of great insights, a lot of pros to the text, which we will get into in a second. A last bit of information was we had a conference, which was a lot of fun, this last weekend with Courtney, and I was the only Orthodox. No, I take that back. John Klizek was Orthodox. He was a speaker, but the day that I spoke, it was all essentially classical liberal thought and myself, which is not bad. I can always talk and interact and get along with people. However, they invited a guy, I was not familiar with him, who was a somewhat prominent Reformed person. And he gave the talk first on Saturday. And it was a great talk. He actually said a lot of stuff that I agreed with. We were pretty much on the same page, providentially. I spoke on Merloo's book and compared it to Arthur Koestler. And I kind of went into some of the history of dialectics in church history. So I'll get into some of that when I give tonight's discussion. Anyway, all that was kind of behind paywall. So today we're going to be talking about the book for my audience, for you guys. Oh, I got a couple other things I got to mention too. But all that to say that, so everybody gave their talks, and then in the lengthy 3.5 hour podcast section, it was myself, Dr. James Lindsay. Lindsay and I actually got along really well. We had, I sat with him at dinner, and we talked most of the evening. And there were some other sort of Cold War era boomer thinkers there, all of whom I can appreciate in terms of their perspectives on what they, I try to learn from anybody I can learn from. But again, I just feel like a lot of the boomers are really out of touch, shocker, right, with the thought processes of anyone under 40 and under, 50 and under. And so they just don't understand it. They really continually think in these Cold War era dialectical processes, which is ironic because most of their topics are about dialectics and Marxism and all that. I will say that I think Dr. James Lindsay, I think, is an expert on communism. He really is. I mean, he knows everything. He knows way more about Marxism than I do. Doesn't mean I agree with him on all of his topics. I will say, though, that I'm able to learn from him about Marxism and communism. For example, I don't know a whole lot about China and its setup. He actually had a lot of really good information on the relationship of Kissinger, Brzezinski, and others to setting up this mixed economy that they have in modern China, which is a basically party-owned monopoly capitalism, I guess you could call it, mixed with state communism. Anyway, he had some really good information on all that, which is not something I know a whole lot about. I just know about it from like Rockefeller's biography and so forth. But a lot of the information that he talked about fit well with what I've read. I also think on that China tip, there's a crucial element that a lot of people have missed, which Whitney highlighted in her book in relationship to Chinagate. And there's this whole kind of unknown story. Some people know it. I think a lot of people in the Trump administration actually know about this, and this probably motivated what you were hearing the Trump administration hammer back in 2017, which was about China. And I remember at the time I was thinking, well, what does China have to do with any of this? I don't get it. Remember when he shut down the Confucian Society? Because it's openly kind of a front for the Chinese government and all that. Anyway, everybody I'm sure remembers this, but there's a great puzzle piece chapter in volume 2 of Whitney's book on Chinagate. And Chinagate, if you don't remember, is the 1990s, mid-late 90s scandal of the Clinton administration Gore, Larry Summers, all of these people connected to these very shady characters like a guy named Johnny Chung. Yes, that's really his name. It's not a character out of Big Trouble in Little China. This is an actual dude. And Whitney really goes hardcore with Clinton, Charlie Tree, the Toddy group, the Lippo group, Inglap Singh, and how all of that tied into the ways in which the Clinton administration was in bed with China, and it ties into Jeff Stein McEffrey. Shocker. So there was a lot of technology being given to China at that time, and I remember neocons were going crazy about this at the time. They were hyping it up, and they always make it out like, oh, it's like, oh, China's the enemy. Oh, but what about Jeff Stein McEffrey and all the compromise and his angle giving stuff, his crew, to China? That's never mentioned. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, that I think ties into this area that not many people know about, because it starts to get more and more complex. And you say, well, what does that have to do with now? Well, now you understand why people like Waltz, right, is so close to China. See how this is starting to make sense? Anyway, just read her Chinagate chapter. It makes perfect sense. But at the time, the neocons, I have a book by one of those neocon dudes, the Free Beacon guy, Bill something. And he wrote a book about Chinagate that I have, and from a long time ago. He wrote it in like 2000. And it was like, Bill Clinton is a communist because he's given our tech away to China and North Korea. It's like, Bill Clinton's not a communist. He's a third way proponent, just like Tony Blair was a third way proponent, which is the synthesis of the two. So look, it doesn't matter whether you call it communism or whatever you want to call it. My point is that foreign governments will collude. Middle Eastern foreign governments will collude with Chinese foreign governments to steal Western U.S. tech. In fact, did you even know that, what's his name? Jack Parsons. I think Jack Parsons got in trouble for giving technology to Israel. Few know this. We're sort of the masters of few know over here. Anyway, but definitely go read these comments. I forgot to have this up. Look at this one. I'm switching gears. The internet was the worst thing that could have happened to Islam. 7,500 likes. And the Muslims are all saying that Christians bought a bunch of bots. Yeah, it's not your poor debate performance and your terrible argumentation and goofy inability to conceive of hypotheticals and answer basic questions. No, it has to be a giant PsyOp and Christians buying bots in the comments. Sure. Okay. So, if you would like to support the stream, thank you for everybody. And by the way, AC, I appreciate those super chats. AC has been a huge supporter and super chatter. I have not forgotten to make the tag video for TikTok. You sent money specifically asking for that, and I will remember to do that. It is on my mind to do. I still got to figure out how to squeeze tag into 1 minute. I think it can be done. Just got to figure out. I might have to practice it a bunch of times to do it. But now, last thing I want to talk about is just this. Some people who were nice enough to send me a very well put together book. I'm not sure exactly why. I think he just wanted me to mention it. Now, I'm not a proponent of Neoplatonism. Of course, we know that Neoplatonism is one of the key elements of opposition of the early church. It influences many of the heresiarchs and the heterodox. It's also important to understand, though, to a degree, because it does influence some of our theology in the Orthodox Church. For example, the Logi doctrine. Other areas that few people know about that we have to combat is the fact that the argumentation that Plotinus uses in the Aeneid is actually copied in some sections almost copy and paste in Augustine's On the Trinity to argue for the Filioque. Did you know that Augustine pretty much copies and pastes almost exactly areas for Filioque? And this is one example would be Aeneid 6:8-13, and then Aeneid 8. Maybe it's 8:8-13. No, 6:8. I get these. Yeah, 6:8-13 and 6:8-15 and 6:8-16. All of those areas of Plotinus and the Aeneids are very close to terminology, argumentation, and paragraphs in the latter sections of Augustine's On the Trinity when he tries to argue for the need for Filioque. And as you know, Plotinus's philosophy is dialectical. It's based on necessary dialectical tensions. That's precisely why we said to those Guber Thomists that relations of opposition doesn't work in a triad, and it's a Neoplatonian doctrine, a Neoplatonic Platonian doctrine. And anyway, the point of all this was that I do want to give a shout out to the guys who sent me this free copy of this really nice book called Monad, and it's a gigantic collection of what they believe to be the pertinent sections of Plotinus. It actually doesn't have the Augustinian sections that I mentioned, Porphyry and Proclus. So some of these I imagine are kind of hard to find in terms of like good translations and a quality volume. And although I am not in any way promoting Neoplatonism, if a person did want to have a good copy of that, this is the version if people want to get that. So thanks to the guys that sent me this for free. It is the translated by the Thomas Taylor edition with an introduction by Ken Wheeler, who I believe is a modern Neoplatonist guy. Anyway, separate issue, but thanks to those guys for sending me that. If people are interested in that topic, that's if you're interested in the source material. But again, it doesn't actually have. I wish it would have had the section. It does have important sections from the Aeneids. I'm not saying that they took about the first 300, 400 pages are the Aeneids, but you probably have to go to like the Cambridge set, the Great Book series. I mean, there's probably other translations of the Aeneids, but the Cambridge Books version of the Aeneids has them all, and it has these sections that I'm talking about where Augustine got some of the argumentation for Filioque, which is, again, just kind of silly, honestly. And for those that would like a further critique of that, if you remember, a couple days ago, we pulled up and I still will never. Here it is. This is an Orthodox, I think he's a priest. Yeah, Father Panagiotis Papageorgiou, Plotinus and Eunomius, a parallel theology of the three hypostases. You'll notice that the problem with using Plotinian philosophy as a way to try to argue the Trinity or the Filioque is absurd, and it ends up, if you're really consistent with it, in Eunomius' position, because Father Panagiotis demonstrates that Eunomius is borrowing directly from Plotinus. Distinction must entail diminution. So if the Son is distinct, if he's not the Father, then he must be in some way ontologically diminished. And wouldn't you know, that's what Muslims argue. If God is not one, he is three, that is polytheism. The Son, not God. The link to this paper is in the chat. It's a great demonstration of this point. And also, again, to further illustrate how silly and ignorant the Roman Catholic argumentation from a couple weeks ago is on this topic, which they still haven't read these papers. I gave it to them, and they still haven't read it. I don't think they will, because they're not really interested in figuring out what the truth is on these positions. They're interested more so in clicks and attention. So, Procession of the Holy Spirit and Orthodox Trinitarian Doctrine contains Vladimir Lofsky's extensive critique of relations of opposition, and how Aquinas uses this to try to bolster the Filioque, and how it makes no sense in the triad, and that relations are not persons. But they never even got that. All they wanted to do was bark and yell and act like they beat me in a debate by kicking me from a stream. And in their rage and stupidity, if they had just read this article, they would have seen what I was getting at. But wouldn't you want to know what the other side is saying? I would. Also, we did a great show made by Jim Bob and Posh, critiquing Christian Zionism, premillennialism, dispensationalism, rapture theology. You can check that out over at Jim Bob's channel. It's also here on my Twitter. It ended up being pretty long, pretty thorough. And we're talking like 3. I was on for almost 3 hours. They went for 4. Anyway. Now, to get to today's topic, why does this matter so much about Grape of the Mind? Why would we want to look at this classic text in regard to, I don't say mind control. Well, it's kind of mind control. Because what you've noticed in the last 4 years is a lot of this information, a lot of this being rolled out. And my suspicion is that in the next few years, you will see the same information and stuff rolled out. Right? In other words, we saw the PsyOps rolled out. Harvard University admitted that they utilized PsyOps to scare the crap out of people, and the Canadian government used those studies during COOF to scare people into doing things. We are presently being told about, right? Now you got to be scared about that. And they're going to roll out the same stuff. Got a hold of the wrong stuff. It's going to be rolled out. It's rolling out right now. Will the public buy it? Will they buy into monkeys? Monkey pop. You know what I'm talking about. And let's see. I believe she's Bannon's co-host. I do not know this person well, but she has recently followed me and has shared a couple things. Her name is Natalie Winters. I don't know her. I think she's Bannon's co-host or something. She's in the Bannon sphere. I also met one of the other people in the Bannon sphere at the Bitcoin conference. The people are having other events, meetups. Joe Allen, who is pro-Gnostic, pro-transhumanist. So we don't agree on things, but he was a nice guy in person, gave me his book. I gave him my book. We talked about setting up a debate. His book is called Dark Aeon by Joe Allen. And I think this woman is Bannon's co-host. I'm not sure, but she tweeted out saying that the WEF has warned of 2024's era of shock events. Now, this ties into future shocks to the system. This came up in our weekend conference. One of the last questions of the 3-4 hour podcast was, what's coming? I said, shock events. Guess what? I'm on the right page because Klaus and his buddies are saying the exact same thing. The destabilizing shock events could include a cyber pandemic, a new global extremist op that would emerge, and climate stuff. So these are the things that Klaus and company are worrying about. And again, further proving that this is all intentional. There was an interview with Justin Trudeau. And this was about the status of the walls. You can guess what I'm talking about. And yeah, we just need Absolutely no walls at all. Just let it all hang out. Everybody can come chill. In fact, everybody should come chill and everything should be paid for. Right? How does that fit into today's topic? Well, it fits into today's topic because in order to get into the scenario where we are, totalitarian regimes have to utilize extensive amounts of propaganda, techniques of brainwashing, social engineering, mind control, language control, educational control, and even mass drugging of the population. And so the book begins, now this was written, as we know, he was a Dutch Jewish psychologist, and his book is on the psychology of thought control, menticide, and brainwashing. The book was written in 1956. So we're going to look for the insights. I'm also not going to agree with everything. There's going to be areas I would critique and disagree. And he says that if you want to understand the way minds are controlled in the modern world, you got to understand things like witchcraft, voodoo, sorcery, and spells. Not necessarily because the elites are, in his argumentation, literally doing spells, but because the techniques of witchcraft, sorcery, and spells have been studied to know how to and understand how to weaponize them. For example, we have heard, I'm sure myself, you've heard me, many other people talk about Michael Aquino's text, From PsyOps to Mind War, the Psychology of Victory. And this was written in 1980 by Michael Aquino, the founder of the Temple of Set, famous Satanist. Not many people know, though, that he wrote a bunch of other books. I've read a couple of those. I read his book on Egyptian sorcery. But he actually has another I think it's about 300-page book on this topic of PsyOps and mind war as well. And what does he argue? Well, he says if you really want to understand how to control the minds of the population or your target audience, you actually should begin by understanding ancient occult religions. Because many of those occult systems and pagan imperial systems were structured around and had perfected, even in their day, very good forms, very efficient forms of mind control for the population. Merloo says essentially the same thing, and he says that some similar types of things might have been used in the Salem witch trials. I don't have any hard opinion either way about the Salem witch trials. I don't have a problem saying that maybe there really were witches, or maybe the insane Puritans were actually persecuting people who weren't. Maybe the people who were persecuting were the real occult witches, and that's why within a few, 100 years or so, you have an underground wellspringing in the Eastern Seaboard elite of supporting witchcraft. These universities leaving their, quote, Calvinist roots and becoming Unitarian. And and then Unitarianism seems to have a long pedigree and lineage of being a cover and a front for covens and witchcraft as well. So somebody wrote a great master's thesis on that a long time ago, and I'll never find it again. It's been lost to the internet. I wish I could find it, but somebody had a great master's thesis arguing that some of the elite Eastern Seaboard families who had this Puritan lineage were in actual fact practitioners of the craft. And I don't mean masonry, I mean witchcraft. I'm sure a lot of them were masons too, but let's see. Some of the key, the book begins by giving examples of techniques. The enemy will use contradictions, for example, to mind F you, to mind F the target. All views of the public will be undermined except the view that the state wants to give. We're going to use the state as an example. It could be the corporate state, could be the communist state. So this is not a libertarian, this is not a public-private debate issue. We're calling the state just the power structure. Maybe we should just call it the power structure, right? Power structure will use guilt. The power structure will intentionally promote contradictions. And this helps us to understand why It doesn't make any sense to assume that that things are being run by idiots, right? They're all the boobs in Washington. If we just throw them out, it's not the boobs in Washington that are calling the shots. Especially look at the last few years of Joe, Sleepy Joe, right? He's not calling the shots. Who is? People above them. And the fact that it's been known since 1950s and earlier that totalitarian regimes know to intentionally push contradictions, that this is actually a strategy. This shows us that it's not just incompetence that's running things. He gives some examples of classic people kidnapped and mind controlled. Cardinal Mazinski, this is a famous Cold War story. They made the movie about him with Obi-Wan Kenobi. You don't need to mind control me. I have the Force. If you've seen, I don't remember the name of that movie, Prisoner? It's called The Prisoner, yeah. And the idea is that they were trying to brainwash Cardinal Mazinski, the communist, right? The system will use all these methods, not just on individuals, but they'll take the studies and the research of the individual and put it on the masses. Have I not said that forever and ever and ever? Yes, I have. The intention of all these techniques is to wear down the public, to get the public or the individual under the control, under the attempted menticide, to have a break. You want to break them. Now, does that not better explain all of the systemic open lies and contradictions that we see almost on a daily basis? Of course it does. And yet, how many idiots, especially in the so-called conservative world, are still under the delusion that we are run by incompetent idiots? Why? Because they think that it's Kamala and Joe that are really running everything. And the boobs in Washington. Okay, it's not zillionaires. No, it's politicians who make $250,000, $300,000 a year. Yeah, they make more with insider trading, I'm well aware. No, they're really calling the shots. No, you see, it's Rand Paul that's calling the shots, right? He's keeping everyone down. It's not David Rockefeller and the zillionaires. No, it's the boobs in Washington. The system uses these methods, the control system, on the masses. One of those keys is not just wearing them down through intentional attempts at menticide and breaks, but the implementation of drugs. DRUG warfare. We talked about this in the Promotion of Vices lecture that we did on SC espionage. I did a whole lecture on you guys. Cardinal Mazinski. It's a famous case. Cardinal Mazinski. Communists brainwashing him. Obi-Wan Kenobi played him in the movie. Very famous, classic Cold War stuff. They also use fake guilt. If you can manipulate your audience, it's a tremendous power. Well, are you starting to notice that it's not just Koof? Wait a minute. This is all of the last decades of social justice warrior strategies and techniques. If you're a honky man, you're inherently evil and guilty, right? That's a form of guilt manipulation. You must pay for the sins of your ancestors. Well, that's a guilt manipulation. And remember, the people who are always touting this don't even believe in sin. They don't believe in guilt because they're atheist, relativist, subjectivist weirdos. Oh, but suddenly they do believe in collective guilt and guilt that's passed. They believe in Augustinian original sin all of a sudden, right? These crazy liberal types, the social justice warriors. You're a white male. Remember that? Screaming, freaking out. One of those famous SJW clips. You're going to notice the SJW techniques are identical to the classic Soviet techniques, the mind control techniques, and the MK CIA techniques. Guess what? It's just no different. Now, I don't know that Dr. Merloo knew about MK. However, he does stumble upon a couple areas where he almost seems like he's admitting it, even though he probably doesn't know about the actual projects. Unless, I mean, this is pretty early. I doubt But he stumbles upon a few things that kind of vindicates elements of it. Fear is another thing. Alienation. So make sure your target population is solitary, afraid, alienated, potentially drugged, and that can be in various types of ways. That could be through allowing things like fentanyl into the population. It can be done also through big pharma. It could be done through all kinds of ways. The water supply, as we're going to see from one of our example characters here. Manipulation, again, of guilt. Other vices, not just drugs, but also mass promotion of degeneracy is a form of warfare, culture war. We saw this in the character Kenji Dohara. Remember that? When we did our lecture on the history of sexpionage? Kenji Dohara was the Japanese aficionado of weaponizing vices and sexpionage. But he also used opium, just like the British Empire had used opium. Kenji Dohara used opium on the Chinese as well. So those are some of the basics that we should expect the totalitarian system to use to control. And again, yeah, to a degree, every giant power block system will probably use some form of these for control, because power blocks tend to want to concentrate power and to be totalitarian. Next, however, Merloo discusses Pavlov. I'm sure you've all heard of Pavlov, but we can't forget Pavlov as one of the key figures of operant conditioning and mind control. Old Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, the Russian-Soviet experimental neurologist, physiologist known for his discovery of classical conditioning through puppy dogs. Woo, woo! Woo, woo! Oh! Ring that bell, baby. You can ring my bell. Ring my bell. Woo, woo! Ring-a-ling-a-ling. Y'all heard of Will Smith? Ring my bell. Anyway, operant conditioning. Pavlov had the idea in the Soviet Union to set up a Pavlov Council. Why is this? To condition, to study, master the techniques of operant conditioning, to create the perfectly Soviet machine man, the conditioned man. A scientific Pavlov Council. In other words, total technocratic, physicalist mind control. The idea was that man could be completely understood and controlled through conditioned reflex, stimulus response, reflex response. Man, Pavlov said, is a pure animal. He's essentially a kind of machine, like an animal. He's a mechanical man. In my terminology, he's a manimal. So the idea is that man is pure manimal. And this easily transitions into the idea of cyborg man. Pure reflex, according to Pavlov. Man is a being that is like an animal or a machine. It is all determined by input-output and thus a feedback loop. You probably remember the documentary Minds of Men. Dr. Peter Bregan's work deals with this. Where did he get this idea? Well, Merloo argues that the idea for purely mechanical man is from Descartes' mechanist view of the universe. We've discussed the mechanist view of the universe many, many times. The universe is a giant clockwork machine wound up. God's a deistic being who steps back and lets it run. That ends up being many of the deists of the Enlightenment, their perspective on the universe, the machine universe. But because of these presuppositions, because of this idea, Pavlov thought that you could ultimately create a complete conditioning and control of mankind through these methods. This is where we get the idea of the bell. The bell rings, the dog salivates because he's used to the imprinting through nature right? So you have the nature-nurture debate. These people play a role in that. Sometimes they fall on either side of it. But don't misunderstand, this is not a fully Western thing here. In other words, Eastern thing. This is not just a Soviet Eastern thing. There are absolute mirror people in the West who essentially share the same presuppositions, the same naturalism, the same physicalism, the same anti-soul, anti-metaphysics view of these guys. People like Carl Rogers, who is in some of the elite texts that we've covered. Give you some examples. So in other words, at the same time as Pavlov is doing these horrible sort of mind control things, in the West, and this is a shout out to beautiful Tristana for hipping me to this book, the Rockefeller Foundation promoted and helped to essentially create the rise of the new biology, the molecular vision of life. Caltech, Rockefeller Foundation, and the rise of the new biology. This is not a critique. This is like a system promoted book. So in the West, you have the exact same type of man is just a manimal perspective. Carl Rogers has this view. Guess what? He's in the Millennium Book with Salk, with Tim Leary, with Marilyn Ferguson of the Aquarian Conspiracy fame, Barbara Marx Hubbard, who writes about her transhumanist stuff back in the 1970s and 80s in this book. Willis Harman is in here. And remember, in this book, he uses essential, non-essential workers. This was 1981. 1981. All of these goober New Agers. And by the way, so you understand, these same goofies are the minds and brains of like the Democratic Party today. Barbara Marx Hubbard was running with Dukakis, wasn't it? Wasn't she Dukakis's? Remember Dukakis, Michael Dukakis? We just watched Donnie Darko, and I was cracking up because Donnie Darko's dad was kind of seething when he was watching the Bush-Dukakis debate. I'm trying to make sure that now you can find these funny speeches. I think they're still on YouTube of Barbara Marx Hubbard. Am I right though that she was his running mate? It's something like that. But I mean, this woman's batshit insane, right? I mean, this is like, boomer, new age, transhumanist extraordinaire. Okay.
Does anybody think they just finished? They've done everything they need.
So, I mean, and to her credit, she's been talking about transhumanism since way before any of us were, as a proponent. In fact, her chapter in the book is about her. Let's see. Here's her chapter: conscious evolution. Right. Here's Barbara Marx's chapter in this classic book. There she is, right there. Conscious evolution, 1980. Shout out to John Adams, by the way, for hipping me to this book. He's the one that found this. She says, "Oh, we got to get away from understanding the world as some sort of, Newtonian thing." She says, Gaia, the world is Gaia in process. That means that you're not an individual. You're part of Gaia. You're part of Mother Earth. Anyway, the fascinating part of this is that she ends her chapter talking about how you will be a cybernetic cyborg being in the Matrix. Transhumanism. So you can laugh at these goofy boomer witches like this. Ha ha ha, they're so silly. Look at these idiot Democrats. Yeah, but they are literally tied into all of the giant foundations that run everything. And they've been talking about what is rolling out since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I mean, again, Tim Leary is in here. This has everybody in. So, point of all that was just to say, look, because Pavlov is doing this over with the Soviets, it doesn't follow from that. But then in the West we've got we've got the good guys fighting them. No. The people in the West are doing the exact same thing of figuring out pleasure, pain, stimulus response conditioning. In fact, if you remember, in the Minds of Men documentary, all the people at MIT that were coming up with what becomes the internet and cyborg stuff, cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, they were all operating on stimulus response feedback loops. In fact, Norbert Wiener's book, Cybernetics, in the first 20 pages, let's see if I can get it. Cybernetics, Norbert Wiener. Within the first 10 pages, page 11, you're going to start to notice, hey, wait a minute, I've heard of these things before. From where? Well, he says, let's get into the history of cybernetics. Well, cybernetics comes out of Bell Labs. Bell Labs. Okay, keep that one in mind. Cybernetics has its origin in the Macy Foundation. Okay, keep that one in mind. He mentions Leibniz too, by the way, which is, I wrote a whole essay in my meta-narratives book on Leibniz. Then he mentions von Neumann and Gregory Bateson. Von Neumann we covered in the history of DARPA and in the Alex Abea Rand Corporation book. And he mentions Gregory Bateson, who is part of, you got it, MK Ultra. But that's not it. With the support of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, what do all those things have in common? MIT, Rockefeller Foundation, Macy Foundation, Gregory Bateson, Bell Labs. What do they all have in common? All of them, except for maybe Bateson, comes up in John Marx's classic book about MK Ultra. They're all MK Ultra projects. They're all fronts. Human Ecology Foundation, Macy's, etc. Macy Foundation. All of those are in the background of MK Ultra. Why? To do what? It's not so much about creating Scarlett Johansson, Mila Jovovich, mind-controlled assassins that can go and kill you. It's about mastering the human mind to control the all mind. How do you control all minds? Well, cybernetics is a great way to do it. That's why both Walter Bowert's book, Operation Mind Control, and John Marx's book, the two most famous books about MK Ultra, first written in the late 70s, both of those books end with chapters about cybernetics, implants, and chips, and how MK Ultra moves into transhumanism. That's the key. You couldn't have any of that without the notion of man as a pure stimulus response being, a manimal, from people like Carl Rogers, Pavlov. And so in the case of, say, Pavlov, the learned response, pleasure, pain, conditioning situation, because Pavlov also did the stuff, I think he did if you remember, he did the stuff of the mouse on a shock floor, right? And then in the mouse, if he did something wrong, he would get shocked, but if he did something right, he would get a treat, right? So that's another Pavlov thing. And what happens is that in those cases, it's obviously test animals being tortured. But in reality, it's the relationship that a handler or a controller has to his subject. You see this perfectly in the chapter where you have the dialogue between Winston and O'Brien. Exact same model, right? The relationship between the handler and the subject, or between the mad scientist and his whatever you want to call it. So essentially these people are insane. They're mad scientists. That's what I'm getting at. Unless you doubt me on that, let's look at another example. Famous MK Ultra doctor. Same worldview as Pavlov. Dr. Jose Delgado, one of the most famous MKUltra doctors. What's his book called? Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. In other words, because man is manimal, if we control his brain, we'll control his mind. All right, next chapter, moving on past, I think he's past Pavlov. No, he's still in the Pavlov chapter. He says, one of Pavlov's goal was to figure out how to get rid of inner resistance. And so all the operant conditioning is essentially engineered towards this goal of ridding the subject of inner resistance against the techniques. This helped to solidify this notion of the formation of mass opinion and mass man and mass media. This lines up perfectly with Walter Lippmann, his public opinion stuff, all the Tavistock stuff that we've talked about. And by the way, I did get finally this text. I've not read it. I've only skimmed it, looking for certain references. I've not yet seen things related to Lippmann, although I'm sure it does cover public opinion. There is a whole chapter. There are actually multiple sections on public relations. But this is the official 50 years of Tavistock. Okay, so this is a academic text, a Rutledge text. It's not a conspiracy book. The official 50 years of Tavistock, written by, who wrote this? H.V. Dix. Let's see, when was this written? 1970. So it's actually a 1970 book highlighting Tavistock back to 1920, 50 years of Tavistock. And we've covered Tavistock many, many times. I'm not going to rehearse it all. But somebody might say, well, I don't trust your account of Tavistock because you went to Coleman. So my thought was, well, perhaps Coleman isn't right. Now, I don't think he's wrong. I think what I read and what we analyzed in the Tavistock book by Coleman, nothing in there really seemed implausible. It seemed pretty clearly the case. But whether it was Coleman himself or his editors or whoever, it's terrible when it comes to sources. So maybe Coleman wasn't right in it. Right? That theoretically that's possible. Maybe he's got bad sources. Maybe he does it sources. It's not well annotated. So why not get the 50 Years of Tavistock book? Yes, exactly. Now, what do we find? Well, it turns out everything about John Rawlings Rees and Kurt Lewin is correct. It turns out everything about public relations is correct with Tavistock. The Institute for Human Relations claims are correct. The relationship of Tavistock to MIT and Michigan, University of Michigan, is correct. The information about Eric Trist is correct. All of that is backed up in this book. So even just skimming the 50 years history of Tavistock, official academic publication, pretty much backs up Coleman's thesis, regardless of whether he's a conspiracy theorist or whether he just failed at annotating the book very well. So, back to Pavlov. The goal of the removal of the inner rebellion against the control system. This is, by the way, if you've read 1984 recently, you notice, dude, this is all like straight up. This perfectly mirrors the Winston O'Brien chapters. The debate when they're having debates when Winston's being tortured, right? Pavlov also came to think that you could imprint reflexes through certain words and stimuli reactions, associating certain things through certain stimuli, and ultimately the goal was depersonalization. Leveling the mind, what the Tiny Mustache Men followers called Gleichschaltung, was for Pavlov a depersonalization effort. This overlaps, by the way, with Vogelin, because in these types of systems, another thing that they came up with in the Soviet was that the Soviet structures was that you couldn't question the thing at all, and really questioning wasn't allowed. Why is that? Well, they didn't want to give people, for example, in prison camps are also places where a lot of research and mind control experimentation was done. So they would get POWs or whoever, and then they would do a lot of tests and experimentation for this stuff on POWs. They wouldn't allow you time to reflect, time to question. That's one of the reasons for the monotonous, absurd manual labor in concentration camps. You're only allowed to memorize things. And again, the idea was that because man doesn't have a soul, the way to condition these wayward people who are rebellious is to treat them essentially the way that you would train a dog. So that's the Pavlovian chapter, man as laboratory animal as manimal. And again, it's not a purely Soviet thing. The CIA, MK Ultra, they're all doing the exact same thing in the West, there and at Tavistock. Medical submission. The next chapter, he delves into the history of drugs. One thing is that the drug handler or dealer provides a relationship of dependency to his clientele. And we already saw this in, again, the case of sexpionage and the history of Kinji Doihara. Doihara was perceptive enough, if you guys recall those lectures, to wed the opium trade to his brothel spy network. Thus, he was able to establish a vast network of spies, not just through SE espionage, but because the people were also dependent upon him for opium. So his opium addicts and hoes was a very effective technique for demoralizing and controlling his Chinese opponents at that time. This also led even the Russians to defeat when the Russians were demoralized and lost, I think we read that, right, to Doihara's armies. Now, this is where it gets a little more interesting in the drug chapter, because Merloo goes on to talk about how mind control can happen through medication. In fact, studies have been done on the ancient religious rituals, ecstatic trances, and the bacchanalia. He doesn't mention this, but if you guys remember, we just covered in the Cambridge Companion to Western Mysticism the ancient mysteries, which utilize drugs, ecstasy, right? That was also mentioned in the Cambridge Companion. So it's been studied. Here he's saying it's been studied for the purpose of mind control. Now, how long have we been saying that MK Ultra and these various projects? He's talking about how totalitarian regimes have studied the usage of ecstatic religious rituals and drugs combined together for mass conditioning. Huxley and these other people talk about how raves, he doesn't call them raves, but he says synthetic music, giant festivals can be mass rituals. Merloo talks about opium and the history of that and various past examples. And then he says hypnotism. Hypnotism can also occur when the state, as the big drug dealer, becomes a kind of handler, daddy figure, God figure who doles out drugs as sacraments. In fact, he says the ancient, I didn't actually know this, he says, unless Aquino talked about in one of his books, the ancient Egyptians apparently knew about hypnosis. So he says they were pretty proficient at hypnosis. Not everybody is susceptible to hypnosis, right? So it's only a percentage of the population that is actually very susceptible to hypnosis. So it doesn't work on everybody. But if you are the state and you want to have power and control, it's very tempting to try to marshal and utilize hypnosis on the masses if possible. Then he talks about what, again, isn't exactly MK Ultra, but inadvertently backs up what everybody has criticized about MK Ultra and theorized about it in part, which is that many studies and approaches to hypnosis were part of MK Ultra as well. And the notion of programming people in a hypnotized state to do certain things. Trigger codes, alters. It is discussed here on pages 62 and 63. He doesn't say he knows for sure how effective it is, but it has been studied and it is possible, he says. Mass hypnosis, he says, is also possible. And the totalitarian state would like to have the masses in a place of mass hypnosis or mass form psychosis. Sounding familiar? You've probably heard this term in the last few years. Oh, actually, what you're hearing is not new. Right? Mass M, you know what? And that's one of those terms that flags the algorithm, so I'm not going to... Guess what? It was already in this book. In 1956. In fact, if I recall, the way I heard about this book was during COOF. Somebody was talking about that terminology, and they said it was in this book. So I was like, oh, interesting. I didn't know. I've never heard of this book. I'm going to get it. The exact phraseology is not in the book, I don't think, but the idea is there. Mass formation of hypnosis is there. And engineering of consent is in this book. So Chomsky, right, the engineering of consent, guess what? That was already in this book. Now, as I was reading through these chapters, particularly here, this chapter of other techniques that the power structure, the handler, the mind controller, the state can do, it reminded me of religions, quite obviously. Now, the focus of the book's not religion, but he does constantly touch on it because elements of religious control, and particularly cults, play into this. And of course, we know all of our atheist buddies and our agnostic friends. Oh, religions are a cult, man. You're all in a cult, dude. Yeah, I know. We've heard this a million times. We know that's what you think. But even if you think that, let's set that aside for a moment. Certainly some religions exemplify a totalitarian cult behavior more than others. We can think of examples like Scientology, Jonestown. We've all heard of those a million times. Brainwashing, mind control, Heaven's Gate, blah, blah, blah. But because I was reading this book, as I was also interacting and prepping and, dealing with Muslims, I was thinking, actually, a lot of this perfectly lines up with Islam, doesn't it? And I'm not just singling out Islam. You could say, oh, does it line up with Rabbinic Judaism? Yes. Sure. But Islam is more on my mind because of the recent debates. And if you notice, one of the reasons that I asked Daniel in the debate about the washings that they do, voodoo, was because, in Christian theology, there's a reason for these bodily washings, right? And the Levitical laws. They're not just arbitrary because God said to do it. But I would argue that in the Talmud, in the rabbinic tradition, and in Islam, there's really no reason why there's all of this madness, I guess you could say, neurosis of I'm going to trick God by buying a certain light switch that I'm not actually flipping the switch, and so it's not actually a work on the Sabbath. I'm going to buy a specific toilet flush that is not allowing me to flush the toilet on the Sabbath. I mean, just silly stuff, right? And then in Islam, we have these washings and these things we do. Why? Because Allah says to. And that was what he said in the debate. Now, in Christian theology, they symbolize moral things because there's nothing inherent. I mean, it's silly to think about something like pork being pork's unclean. Why? Well, didn't God make the pig? Did you ever think about that? Remember in the debate with Azra Rashid? God can't come from vagina. God is not going to near vagina. Didn't God create the vagina? Did you think about that? And by the way, as Sam Shamoon showed, Allah breathes into vaginas. So what are you even talking about? In the hadiths, right? I believe it was in one of the hadiths. But, so anyway, pointless rituals are part of control. So I'm not saying all rituals are mind control. That's what the typical sort of, euphoric atheist would say. It's all mind control, dude. Repetitive, meaningless rituals with no significance are a form of mind control that the totalitarian leader, be he a state controller or a cult leader, can use, you see. And by the way, cult leaders use drugs too, don't they? Of course they do. In fact, Merloo brings up Huxley's Brave New World as a classic example, because remember, he mentions Huxley, and then he talks about doors of perception. Why is he talking about that? Because you guys remember we did a lecture through doors of perception. Huxley says we need to get rid of the Lord's Supper and have a whole new religious sacrament in the West of mescaline. I don't know why he thought mescaline would be the sacrament. He says, get rid of bread and wine, Lord's Supper. No, we want mescaline as the sacrament of the West. Remember that? We did a whole lecture on doors of perception. All right, moving on. Next chapter. Why do people yield? What are the psychodynamics of false confessions? And what ultimately gets people to yield and give up their beliefs, their individuality, whatever, when they submit to the regime, the collective, the system, whatever? People will usually side with authority. This is one reason why appeal to authority, in its most basic sense, is a fallacy. Because depending upon what the debate is and who the authority is, authorities can be wrong. In the totalitarian regime, however, the control state, the super state, the corporate state, whatever it is, the authority cannot be wrong. There is no questioning of it. And if you want to ask questions about the system, those are questions that aren't even on the table. They're outside the magic circle of what Vogelin talked about, and they're not allowed to be asked, you see. So the system controls what questions can even be asked. That's a crucial element to these types of systems. That ultimately is a critique from Eric Vogelin. But unfortunately, because people tend to, on the whole, be somewhat weak, somewhat pliable, somewhat fearful, they tend to defer to and side with authority out of fear and out of a desire for security and projected glory. They want to feel like they're part of the winning team and I agree with the leader or whatever. So mass man, unfortunately, has his views given to him. How? Through the mass media. So they understood that even at this time. This, by the way, is absolutely identical to what Bernays says, right? We've lectured through Bernays' propaganda book. It's one of the classic writings of the elite, and that this jives perfectly with that. It also jives perfectly with the history of Tavistock and the creation of public opinion as a means of control. Public opinion is a two-sided thing, if you remember. One side of public opinion is the system gauging what people really believe, so they have an accurate polling for them. They want accurate polls on one level to know what people really believe. Then they spit out fake BS polls and numbers to engineer the public because they know, historically, people have wanted to typically side with the masses. I want to be on the winning team. I agree with everybody else. I don't want to be an outsider. So yes, thus public opinion is key. And he argues that all regimes that are known as, quote, totalitarian, have utilized this. And by the way, again, the West, the democratic regimes, not only do this, they do it just as much, maybe even in a more subtle way than the totalitarian regimes. Because in a democratic, quote-unquote, regime, it's much more important to control the masses because the whole system is engineered around consent and the idea of lowest common denominator. What's the truth? Well, it's what the masses vote for. It's not what's actually true. It's just what people tend to agree on. That's the base democratic assumption. Now, this is the chapter where a lot of this matches up with Tavistock. I don't know to what degree Merloo knew about or was familiar with Tavistock or its approaches, but essentially what he talks about for the Eurasian communist or tiny mustache man regimes is the exact same thing, again, that Tavistock and the Western powers were utilizing. In fact, in Coleman's Tavistock book, he says that some of the early Tavistock people in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they were immensely impressed with the skills of the tiny mustache men followers for how well they were able to utilize these very techniques. So this is not necessarily anti-fascist. They will utilize all those techniques. They don't care about the mythology of Tiny Mustache Man and Teutonic Knights. Another thing I found very fascinating in this chapter was the admission that one of the ways that the system engineers consent is through, get this was pretty wild, lie upon lie. And you do big lies, and you do them so consistently and so fast that you don't give people, the masses, the opposition, time to formulate a logical response. I thought that was a powerful, fascinating insight. And in other words, the system knows this. How many years have we heard Lord Voldemort say this point? They're doing it on purpose to demoralize you. And so the system puts out one big lie, and then 2 weeks later, Fauci totally contradicts it with another big lie. Wait, what? Are they buffoons? No, this is a technique. It's a technique. And it's an effective technique. All right, moving on. Next section deals with the need for the totalitarian system to create a robot man. I don't mean actual AI, although it does relate to that. That the public is seen as and should be viewed as essentially programmable robotic men. It needs that. It wants that. Because it can't allow other positions, other firewalls to its power. You can't have the firewall of the nation state, of the for example, in American system, the states, right? The traditional American system, the idea is that the states are the highest form of authority and the real locus of power control. The federal government was supposed to be minimal. And, in the last several decades and maybe 150 years, that has flipped to where the federal government is the giant central control system, and the states have less and less power over time. But it's the opposite of the system that was originally intended via the Constitution, right? It's more so a state government. I'm saying the 50 states, the local states, versus the central state. That has all flipped in the last post 1800. You know what I'm talking about. And so these systems then require and want their citizens to be robotic, to be in harmony. And this doesn't mean that everybody should not be in harmony. It's a question of, well, be in harmony about what? The system wants everyone in harmony about whatever the system says. Again, remember, this is personified perfectly in O'Brien. When Winston is being tortured by O'Brien says, Winston, I don't want you to just tell me that 2 plus 2 is 5 because you know that's what I want to hear. Winston, I want you to genuinely and truly believe that 2 plus 2 is 5 because the party says so. You see that? Because Winston starts arguing with him about metaphysics. And O'Brien laughs at this and says, Winston, we don't care about metaphysics, your objective principles of laws, logical. We don't care about that. The party decides what the metaphysics of the world are. And Winston says, but what if you're wrong? He says, we're not wrong because we decided it. We are the incarnation of truth. The party is truth. There's no metaphysics that the party submits to. The party will decide what metaphysics is, what the laws of logic are, when they benefit the party. And I thought this was an interesting insight. This actually kind of touches on some of the JBP arena. In other words, the totalitarian regime, the dictator daddy, it's not just a big brother state or a patriarchal state. The system wants to be all of the archetypes that the public looks to. In other words, it's a daddy state, big brother state, and a mommy state, nanny state. It wants to be both of these, to manipulate both of the archetypes that all human beings look to essentially be a replacement deity. In the perceptive, efficient, totalitarian or control regime is excellent at manipulating to create this situation. And he argues that these systems tend to want necessarily an immature population. That's key. In other words, neoteny. Remember Kotel did a lecture on neoteny. It was great. What was it, like 3 years ago? In other words, the regime wants immature, neotenous individuals. This is a clip, but he did a longer talk. It probably links to it here. And Kotel did this talk because he noticed there were people online were like cheering about their chalky milk and their chicken tendies and their fast food. Here he is, even talking about mac and cheese, chicken nuggets, chalky milk, none of which is an actual meal, none of which is actual food. Living at home, right? Arrested development. You say, what does that have to do with the super state? What does that have to do with? That's nothing to do. No. The state wants that. They want you in a neotenous, immature state. What did Crowley talk about? The aeon of the crown and conquering child, an era of being dominated by base pleasures and childlike desires. That's the aeon that Crowley said would come. That just also happens to coincide with a nanny state and a big brother state. Merloo's term is the, what's he call it? The womb state. The womb state. So the more that the system can have you acting as an immature, emotional being, not in charge of his own destiny, not in charge of his own life, not mature, not learning about the world, not figuring out how to run a business, not figuring out economics, not figuring out investing, not learning about Bitcoin or gold, if you want to be a boomer, not figuring out how to eat healthy, not getting your chalk.com and working out, not going to the gym. No, living on a UBI, living in mom's basement, living in the Matrix, living in video games, living in prawn, living in not having a relationship, living in not learning how to interact with women. Like, that's what the system wants. You as a cog, a child, and the state as mommy daddy. This is why the system loves welfare, UBI, and why it promises all of these things, and you can just live on your pleasure, because then you are a malleable tool of the superstate. You're no threat. You have been neutralized. For the God state, all is known and taken care of. To be a security state, to keep you in your chicky nugget situation, well, they're going to watch you and control everything to keep you safe. We can't have any dangers. And in order to have no dangers, everything will be surveilled, tracked, and traced to keep you safe, to keep you safe. Have we not heard this the last several years? And going back to the Big 9 events, oh, be scared of the terror everywhere. So we will surveil everything. We'll take all of your individual personal liberties to keep you safe in the womb state, the God state, the all-knowing state. This is why the totalitarian regime in the Cold War and in the World War II period and previously relied on a vast network of human spies. And although there are still human spies, nowadays the reliance is on tech surveillance. We must spy on all of the things that you do online to keep you safe. Thus, the state must manipulate the fundamental archetypes that human beings look to, mom, dad, etc. And it gives you those things. The state must also have various types of scapegoats to make you afraid of. Vladimir Putin, this or that terror man, Osama bin Laden, Assad, right? It's a never ending sort of rotating cornucopia of villains that can be trotted out at any moment in any week. And yes, probably many of those people are to a degree villains, but are they the villains that we really need to be worried about? Why are we supposed to only be worrying about this villain this week or this year? What about the other villains out there? Oh, there's no consistency except that they're the villains that the system wants. This was brilliantly portrayed in 1984 in the character of Emmanuel Goldstein. Emmanuel Goldstein is a created fictional villain of the system. And the system rolls him out when it's necessary. He might not even be alive. In fact, he was probably dead. In fact, the system probably reported on his death. And now it turns out he's still alive. But wait a minute, wasn't Goldstein the ally 20 years ago? Well, he was our ally, but now he's our enemy. Mujahideen. Freedom fighters. Now they're Al-Qaeda terrorists. The police state. The police state then becomes necessary to keep you safe, to guard against any dissent. And what happens in a police state totalitarian regime is that as the power increases, the state itself becomes more and more suspicious of members of itself, and it can begin to teeter and totter with a downfall from within. Of course, many people say that this is what happened in Stalin's regime. The purges of Stalin's regime led to a lot of paranoia, and they were purging each other, and everybody's worried about this one's going to purge this one, and it kind of mirrors the purgings that happened in the Robespierre, Danton, Babeuf, all those guys. When they had their purges, they did the exact, I got to purge this guy because he's not true. He's a fat guy. He's a fat guy, so he's bourgeoisie. So he's not really communist, right? So they were using these techniques to get rid of their enemies. They all end up hating each other and undermining each other. So these kind of regimes end up being fragile. But here's an interesting insight that I've not seen other people talk about, but actually comes up in the 1984 chapter if you pay attention. He says totalitarian regimes, much like the individuals in the regimes, become schizo. Literally. They become schizophrenic because they're divorced from reality. They live in a other reality, which is the regime's reality, but that the masses and the leaders must enforce and never allow the fictional reality to invade real reality. This is, Tokyo Rose. This is like, there's many stories of this that, even as the regime is collapsing, they're still putting out the propaganda that they've won. I mean, we saw this with the Muslims in the last week, right? Like the Muslims unanimously got destroyed, and they're just still pumping out like the Tokyo Rose propaganda that the Christians lost the debate, they could not defend the position. Why is this? Well, because the people in a tyrannical regime and the leader of a tyrannical regime are divorced from reality. And so they must never give up the lie, the myth of the regime. Terror is obviously crucial to regimes and to control. Totalitarian regimes utilize mass fear. I wonder if we saw anything like this in the last 4 years. Can anyone think of what might have happened? Maybe there was something in the last 4 years. I don't know. Where everyone, particularly the boomers, had the crap scared out of them. Because they're mommy daddy experts in the state and they're mommy daddy doctors that the boomers worship scared the crap out of them. And because they live in a cult where they worship their doctors and the experts, which they were conditioned to be in, by the way, Quigley said back decades ago that the generation after him, that's the boomers, they would be raised to worship and trust the experts. So the boomers were subjected to a very sophisticated era of propaganda and control. This is why boomers can't question their Cold War narratives. This is why boomers can't question anything except aliens and JFK. That's the limit of where a boomer can go. Unless you're a privileged boomer like my godfather or the ones that I know personally. Not talking to you guys. Thus, the regime must utilize PsyOps, must utilize all kinds of techniques and tricks, which we've already listed. He talks about that again. No time for reflection. You can't talk. You can't sit and think through these things. So you're hit with a barrage. The barrage of information is part of the strategy of keeping you off kilter, destabilized. You can't keep up with it. There's so many lies. One of the best of which was that COOF doesn't affect BLM rallies. And remember, 2,000 scientists and doctors signed a paper stating that Kuf is not a danger to BLM rallies. However, Kuf is a danger to MAGA rallies. I don't care if you want to go to MAGA rallies or not, but the point is that surely anyone with basic critical thinking could see how absurd that is. And it's magical thinking. I thought this is what made me think of the Islam stuff earlier. He talks about purging rituals and the importance of purging rituals. You know, the 2 minutes of hate in 1984 where you scream at the screen. This replaces inner rage. In other words, the system is perceptive enough to know that individuals within these systems are going to be unhappy, right? How do you placate people in a system that are unhappy and hate the system? Well, you come up with means of expressing that hate directed away from the regime. So you have not just the 2 minutes of hate like in 1984 that replaces the inner rage. You have public confessions, show trials. This allows people to direct their anger at the scapegoats. And this was fascinating. He says, or you can have childlike cleanliness rituals. Wow. So I'm thinking the irrational mindlessness of the way that Rabbinic Judaism and Islam, for example, treats washings and rituals, mindless cleanliness rituals that are irrational and neurotic, make no sense, they have no point. But they do serve a point. They placate the individual's anger at the system. It's a replacement form of purgation. Interesting. Fascinating insight there. He talks about how regimes, we've already heard this, have to have spies everywhere. Panopticism, we've talked about that. I'm not going to rehearse all that. This was interesting. Regimes cannot allow, this is again mirrors the 1984 chapter. Regimes cannot have objective truth allowed. This is why that chapter where Winston O'Brien are debating metaphysics is so great, is that it really illustrates the necessary logic of a totalitarian control system like this. A Fabian socialist Ingsoc system. Remember, in 1984, Ingsoc is English socialism. It is Fabian socialism. It's George Bernard Shaw saying, you have to come to me and to us, to the technocrats, and convince us why we should let you live. That's actually a classic George Bernard Shaw thing. You will have to argue to the technocratic elite why they should let you live. Did you know he said that? That's O'Brien stuff. The regime must also tightly control words and perception. Limited vocabulary. Again, 1984. The vocabulary is cut down. They even wanted to use pidgin. I'm not joking. Bertrand Russell, they were the Royal Society elites. They were talking about trying to get the world onto pidgin, so that people wouldn't have the ability to express themselves, wouldn't have the conceptual framework to understand the world. So limited vocabulary, getting rid of the nuance, philosophy, conceptual thinking, have everybody speaking in grunts and emojis, basically. So world control requires word control. Another classic example of this, social justice warriors. Perfect example. This word triggers. This word is a hate word. It's all mind control. That's all it is. And this book is saying that. So in other words, the totalitarian regimes that he's critiquing is exactly what the left and the SJWs do. Perfectly. Also, everything in the totalitarian regime is potentially a criminal action. Everything must be criminalized so that everything can potentially put you away. Some classic examples of totalitarian regime studies that contributed to mind control. Orson Welles' radio broadcast, War of the Worlds, Princeton Research Project. We've talked about that. It's mentioned in my first book. Hadley Cantrell has a whole book on that as a PsyOps study. You could think of other examples as well. All right. That is the first half of Joost Merloo's book, Grape of the Mind. The second half will be to subscribers to my website or to over at my Rockfin. It will go up on both in the next... that's right. He says Esperanto. Excuse me. He said Esperanto. Other people said Pigeon. Russell, I think, said Esperanto. That's correct. Or maybe Russell said Esperanto or Pigeon. But same. The point's the same. But for the second half of the book, you can subscribe to the website. It won't be up tomorrow or tonight. It'll be a few days. It usually takes me a few days to get to getting the part 2s up. But what we're going to do in part 2 is not just the rest of the book. We're also going to use a test case example of a person from the system talking about the techniques that they want to use and push in covert ways. And the book that we will use for that is the classic text from Arthur Kessler, who is in the circles of the elite. In fact, he and his wife even committed dual unaliving together because they were so wedded to this death cult, Ghost in the Machine. So we will, again, we will return to this classic, forgotten, overlooked text for examples of utilizing these techniques that are critiqued in this book. All right, let's see. We've got quite a few super chats. I want to thank you guys for being very generous today. It's very cool. But I want to remind you that we do have 2 show sponsors. Well, we got several, but our main sponsor, our most awesome fave-based sponsor is Chalk.com. I'm wearing this excellent shirt, Chalk.com. Chalk is the best in supplementation. You can get access to that at choq.com. Actually, I will put this on for you. Chalk.com. And that performance male vitality stack is right there. You can also set up recurring subscriptions with the promo code JAY44LIFE. That's J44LIFE. And you'll get those coming on the regular. You can put whatever elements you want on that recurring subscription. Maybe you want just the Tomcat Elite. Maybe you want the Chad mode and the Tomcat Elite. Maybe you want Action 2.0, some of the other products over there. Either way, ladies, you can also make use of this with the ladies performance vitality stack right here. Female vitality stack. Those are great for regulating moods. Jamie actually utilizes these as well. She loves the She Legit. She uses the ashwagandha as well. So there's great products for ladies. But if you didn't know, women can also take Action 2.0 and Tomcat. So also ladies need some testosterone boosting products. But look, all of those are over there organized for you. And I want to remind you about the greatness of Chalk.com with everybody's favorite. I think I brought back Vivek Roboswamy. Did I bring back Vivek? Let's see.
Chad Mode is your ultimate natural pre-workout, designed to take your performance to the next level. Chad Mode is for natty beast alphas only. Whether you're hitting the gym, invading a favela, conquering a small village, gambling, burning the midnight oil, mogging on your coworkers, or getting banned from Facebook, Chad Mode gives you the competitive edge you need. It's as simple as mixing 1 or 2 scoops of our fine powder into water or juice, providing you with a delicious, energizing beverage featuring a burst of sweet, organic fruit flavor. Chad Mode will give you the extra edge you desperately crave. Chad Mode stands out from the crowd by excluding artificial flavors, preservatives, sweeteners, and dyes. We've even avoided so-called natural flavors, ensuring a clean and effective formula. Only soy boys and betas guzzle blue dye and sucralose, further tanking their already low testosterone levels. Chad Mode is made in America. Unlike your common TikTok peasant's pre-workout powder, it does not contain Chinese lab-made caffeine and artificial sweeteners that soy boys so often crave. Experience the pure goodness of Chad Mode with Blue Magic registered trademark organic blue spirulina extract, organic lemon, cherry, and organic maple crystals. Forget synthetic caffeine. Embrace the natural power of organic green coffee bean extract. Each dose of Chad Mode mirrors the caffeine kick of 1.5 cups of coffee, delivering a surge of energy alongside essential vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and herbal extracts. Chad Mode will allow you to fire your boss and mog on anyone who opposes you. Chad Mode will give you a dominant and aggressive edge, like a lion hunting a gazelle, where the gazelle is a TikTok Jim Zoomer macro.
I want to show off something that we're all proud of. I got a browser here. This is Jay Dyer's much vaunted, much sought after Philosophy 101. Now, he just got this page up. We are just testing it out. You guys are some of the first people in the world to see it. I want to say, for my part, it's not Philosophy 101. I think this is a mistitling. I really think of it as like Philosophy Unleashed, because a Philosophy 101 course, they give you kind of some useless information that you can't make sense of. Jay actually lays out over 12 weeks, dozens and dozens of hours put into just the presentation of this, let alone the hundreds and thousands of hours of research that it takes to have a coherent evolution and history of the origins of philosophy, the uses of philosophy, the different ways to look at it over time, and how that has been brought about to what we have today, which is almost an absence of philosophy on the objective logic and reason side, and an overabundance of woke philosophy that is irrational and is made up day by day as people are like, I think we should bring racism back. And then here's a justification. And then it gets wokeified and spread out. And then all of a sudden you have a bunch of communist, socialist ideas where you become the property in action. You need to be able to stand your own ground. It helps to have a foundation in philosophy because it's a method to find truth. When you get down to it, philosophy is there because you love truth enough to go and learn how to find it because it's valuable. So if you're interested in things like that, there is the landing page. We'll link it up in the notes. It is a longer one, so we'll get a shorter URL for this. I'm sure Jay has a link on his page. I just wanted to show it off. Now you know it exists. You can go look for it and see why this is not your father's philosophy, right? So well done. I'm proud of everyone who helped to produce and edit the course. And of course, Jay did a flawless job in presenting the course over those 12 weeks. And he's a juggernaut. He's another guy, just like John Bush, in action all the time, doing something productive, like very little wasted time in his week, those 168 hours of being hard.
All right, welcome back. Thank you guys for being with me today. A lot of fun. I want to remind you that if you want to get my books, whether it's the giant red book, 660 pages of all my stuff, you can get signed copies at the shop at Jay's Analysis. The link is in the show description. That's jaysanalysis.com. You can also subscribe over Jay's Analysis to get part 2 to all of my lectures, talks, interviews, archived for the last 10 years or so through buying a membership. Here's the shop. As you can see, we've got my books, Jamie's Creams, also audio lectures. If you don't want to be a member, you can get just the Tragedy and Hope or just the Plato or Genesis or whatever you're interested in. Those lectures are available as a set in the shop. And yes, all of the shop orders of books are signed copies. So everybody always tells me to sign the books, please. They're all signed. That's the advantage of getting it from the website. It does cost a little bit more than what Jeff Bezos sells it for, but you get signed copies. That's the whole point of the shop. I'm not being rude, just pointing it out, because everybody always tells me this or asks me this constantly. Yes, they're all signed. What else is going on? I was going to do an event in Nashville, but I couldn't find a good venue, so I think we'll probably try to shoot for an event maybe in Florida. If I can't find a venue for that, then we'll start thinking about Nashville again down the road. But I am wanting to do another event. Also, though, I'm really trying to finish the third book. So all the stuff that comes up, I've already been asked to come do more Muslim debates. I have to finish Esoteric Hollywood 3. And if I start debating Ismaili Muslims, I don't know a lot about Ismaili Muslims, but Khalil wanted to set up a debate. I don't have time to learn all about the Ismailis and do the debate and try to finish the book. I have to finish Esoteric Hollywood 3 in the next few months. So I might want to pause the big public debates. We'll keep doing open forums because those are pretty easy. They don't require a whole lot of preparation. But anyway. Face Tiger, $2, $1. I sincerely apologize. It's not my intention to upset you. I don't know what you're referring to. It was a joke. If you're talking about the guy that put up the picture, it did not come off that way. It come off like you're totally being a dick. But I'm assuming you're that guy. I block people like every day. So, you could be one of thousands of people that are blocked. So you have to be more specific. AC, $50. Thank you so much. Thank you for you and Sam doing the brutal crushing of Islam in front of their target audience. You broke their actual scholars. Now they will have only low-tier tough guys. They can't lose face avoiding any more debates. Yeah, I don't know what their strategy is going to be now. We'll have to see. But thank you for that, AC. Appreciate it very much. Julio Merida, $50. Thank you so much, Julio. Much appreciated. He says silence. Storm the Cat, $5. This is all on the topic of dispensationalism. I've seen many evangelical videos, preachers using the same talking points verbatim and the same comments on YouTube and 4chan, and they all promote the same ideas word for word. Yeah, I mean, it's probably just people parroting what they hear. I mean, it's not a very sophisticated system. Dispensation is kind of low tier. And the people that you're going to get in dispensationalism, I'm not being mean, they're probably not the smartest people. So, not the smartest people have a tendency to repeat and regurgitate what they hear from other people. They don't know how to think through these systems or defend them on their own. They just sort of regurgitate. Alula, $5. Thank you so much. She says, she says nothing. Joni, $5 says nothing. Joni, $5 again. I love your videos. Have you thought about making any videos about the Jehovah's Witnesses? If you search, we actually have interacted multiple times with JWs and Arians. There haven't been a lot of them, but probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 where they call in. The debates have been pretty weak. David Atlas, $5. In fact, the very first video I did about the Trinity in the Old Testament, the deity of Christ, which has had a lot of views, was a response to a person making Jehovah's Witness arguments. Everybody remember Rocking Mr. E? That super idiot who had a moment where his channel blew up, and it was so stupid that, I mean, I just can't. How could you be so stupid as to think that that guy was Remember, he claimed to be an Orthodox Christian. He said, "I'm Greek." So what? Well, I'm Greek and I'm Orthodox, and the Orthodox Church teaches Arianism. I mean, I'm not joking. Like, this was so idiotic and gaslighting stupidity. And his channel, does he even exist anymore? I don't even know. I mean, it was the dumbest shit I've ever heard in like years, right? He might have had to move on to one of other platforms. Does he still exist? Okay, this is him, but this isn't his channel. He looks like a weirder Tim Gordon. Right? Like a skinnier, smush-faced Tim Gordon. This guy. There he kind of looks like... He looks like a Persian assassin or something right there. Here he looks like a... like he's in a 90s alt band. Anyway, this guy was something else. I mean, had he... been at least somewhat receptive to people's pointing out his fundamental mistakes, it might have gone better. But the guy was just a complete doubling down goofus who insisted that the Orthodox Church teaches Arianism and literally just repeating Jehovah's Witnesses arguments and saying that's the Orthodox Church. It was that stupid. I mean, like, what? And so I made that video originally refuting him. And then he disappeared. You notice these people just end up eventually disappearing. But remember at the time how he had like, he might have even got up to like 90, 100,000 followers, 80,000 of idiots. And it's like, do you 80,000 people actually believe that the Orthodox Church teaches Jehovah's Witness teaching? It was that stupid. Anyway, so my first video was a response to him, and still up. Jesus, Trinity, deity of Christ. So, I mean, he might as well have been a Jehovah's Witness because everything he was saying was literally from Jehovah's Witnesses. So this whole video here from almost 6 years ago is against his idiotic Jehovah's Witness nonsense, which he was saying was Orthodox. I mean, it's just... what I'm amazed at is why couldn't people at the time see how stupid that was? Why did he have like 80,000 people following him when he was saying the stupidest stuff imaginable that is like, it shouldn't even be controversial. There's absolutely no reason to believe that the Orthodox Church teaches what Jehovah's Witnesses teach. I mean, that's so stupid that, I guess it's just so gaslighty that his like mindless idiot audience is like, I guess the Orthodox Church does teach Jehovah's Witness teaching. Because, like, it must be. I mean, the same mind-numbing idiocy, by the way, is what I see right now in the Roman Catholic and Islamic audiences. Like, the level of what they're saying is as dumb as Mr. E saying that the Orthodox Church teaches the Jehovah's Witness position. I mean, we're at this level now. And, like, what's it going to take? Hopefully, God willing, people will convert and move out of this idiocy. But the same operant conditioning, I guess, of the Muslims and the Roman Catholics, they act exactly the same. And they act exactly like Mr. E's idiot audience acted at the time. Scarlet Pimpernickel, $5. Great work. That was a great debate. You complimented Sam's skills. Did you change your perspective on the amount of focus that we put on sectarianism versus the enemies inside the gates? You mean because of working together with Sam? Not really. I mean, again, Orthodox Church is the only true church. It's not hard, really, to demonstrate that. But I have hope that it's not too late for Sam Shamoon to become Orthodox. When you talk to him about it, he says, I don't know. I'm not ready to say on the issue of papacy and filioque. So, I mean, but at the same time, like, a formal heretic is a person who is obstinate and pertinacious in their error. It's not just a person that's wrong. So I haven't judged, or it's not my place to judge Sam Shamoon. I don't have any judgments on him. But just from a pragmatic standpoint, like, he knows the Muslim texts infinitely better than me, obviously. So I think that the obvious thing to do in the debate was to allow him to cook on the areas that he's, an expert in. I'm obviously not an expert in those fields. So, I mean, unless I wanted to sabotage the debate and try to take over the debate when obviously he's way superior to me on those topics, why would I do it? It'd be foolish. Why would I do it? Eric 337. Do you have videos about Rudolf Steiner? No, but I think anthroposophy is silly. It's just a deviation out of theosophy. I read the Cambridge Companions chapter on him the other day, and it's all just the same gibberish. Anonymous, $5. Do I have a JJ in the eschaton? I think yes. I don't think anyone's biology changes. When Jesus is resurrected, it's a glorified human body that is the same body that he had. So we don't become sexless Neoplatonic monads in the eschaton. Maybe some of these idiot heretics out there think this, but I mean, no. All right, thank you guys so much. I want to remind you too, follow me on X. It seems like X is really the key to growth. I mean, I got in the last 28 days on the analytics, I have 6,000. I've gained 6,000 followers in a month. I gained 2,000 followers in the last 7 days. So X is really the best for growth. I mean, I'm thankful to the debate and everything. I gained 3,000 followers on YouTube in the last couple weeks, so I'm happy for that. But everything's throttled over here. The channel's still demonetized. It probably forever will be. So everything's throttled. But I don't seem to be throttled over here. At least not consistent. Sometimes it seems like they turn off and on things that throttle you. I don't know how all this works, but I mean, if I can gain 6,000 people in a month on Twitter versus the most on YouTube being like 3,000 in a month, I mean, that's twice the heat. And by the way, the debate got almost 1 million views on Twitter, whereas it got 500,000 on YouTube. Not my copy, the original. Also, yeah, sad to see that Riff Tracks got their YouTube channel taken down. Hopefully they'll get it back. Where's the freaking debate? I always scroll past it because it's Myron's wall, not my wall. But also, yeah, check out, by the way, Jim Jatras, our good buddy Jim Jatras, one of the great, awesome, excellent Bays boomers. Good friend of ours that we love, Jim Jatras. His book is out. It's called I Tried to Warn You. I wrote a blurb for Jim's book, so be sure and get Jim's book. I'm sure I'll get a copy of it. Be able to check it out soon. Where is the original debate? Here it is. By the way, I want this to go to 1 million. Let's see if we can get this to 1 million. So here's the original broadcast on X. That's live. Live it had 200,000, but if you look at the tweet itself, it's 861,000 views. So this is almost at 1 million views. So go watch the debate. See if we can get that up to 1 million. Anyway, everybody have a good night.